really puts a smile on my face to see an individual not having to look at Bitcoin as how much money they can make, but it's really been something for me to kind of change my perspective of having to be a more compassionate individual, having to share a technology that is of value. And also, it's also been able to open up doors for me in, let's say, a financial aspect, because every time I would make a certain amount of money, salary as well, I've been able to keep it over time.
Today, I'm excited to welcome Michael Mushunje to the podcast. Michael is a Bitcoin hodler, financial market analyst, and a Bitcoin Reach leader. Welcome to the Bitcoin Edge, Michael.
Hello, hello, hello.
Good to see you all the way from Bulawayo. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I grew up in Botswana and then moved to Zimbabwe in the year 2016. So, to kind of sum it all up, I'm a Bitcoiner. And from the year 2022, that is when my journey within Bitcoin actually began. And yeah, because beforehand, I had known about Bitcoin, but the true understanding and its impact to society wasn't really something I was aware of at the time.
So, what drew you to Bitcoin? I know living in Africa and Botswana has a relatively stronger currency than some of the other African countries. Zimbabwe has a mixed bag, but what was it that drew you to Bitcoin?
Okay, so originally, first when I heard about Bitcoin, I think I was in high school. So at the time, I just kind of read about it, but never really got like the actual concept of it. And then fast forward to the year 2022, where Alex and I met, and then he began to explain to me about Bitcoin, how Bitcoin basically works, how it was created to be a hedge against inflation. And this really kind of intrigued me quite a lot because I would look at, let's say, the normal financial system, the likes of banks, the likes of the gold reserve, etc., etc. And in turn, I began to understand that there's more to having a source of money or a form of money that is of quality and that has value in its essence for the longer term. In my conversation with him back in the day, he explained to me that there is US dollars, right? But at the end of the day, we don't really know how much there is, or it's literally kind of infinite. At this point, I think around like trillions. And also, when we look at gold as well, gold standard, I believe back in the day was something that did kind of suffice within its time era. But then as we move on and on, I believe individuals are meant to equip themselves with something that is more or less digital. Because everything we do nowadays is digital. We're having this podcast digitally, we converse digitally, and having something in its essence that is also of quality and it has a fixed supply kind of gives that power back to the people, because I do believe individuals have been robbed over the years that have come before due to inflation. And especially in Zimbabwe now, we have, I think, about four currency failures ever since Robert Mugabe's era up until this very day. We've had the Zimbabwean dollar, we've had the bond notes, we have the RTGS. Currently, right now, we're on the ZIG, and it's also a little bit shaky at this current moment.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey.
Uh,
Tell us, what are some of the misconceptions about Bitcoin in Zimbabwe?
all right. The first, the, like, it actually makes me laugh every time because the usual misconception is it is a get rich quick scheme. Because usually, if we would host meetups and everything, the very first question that newbies tend to ask us is, how much money can I make? And then I tend to answer it a little bit in a backward sense, but it's not in the reality of how much money you can make, but how much value you can keep for the longer run. How much money are you able to store for your family in a decentralized format, but then still self-custodial to you as an individual. So the misconception of how much money an individual can possibly make usually comes from the standpoint of forex, because within Zimbabwe there are people that tend to do a lot of forex trading, or at times a lot of online gambling. So that concept is still kind of ingrained in them to a certain degree, because they kind of still view it as, okay, maybe tomorrow I can make a 20, maybe tomorrow I can make 100. But as a community, as Bitcoin Reach, we have tried to kind of align individuals to the true essence of what Bitcoin is. The true essence relying on the fact that it is something that is of value to an individual and their family and love.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thing to start educating people. Do you think that for Zimbabweans and many people in Africa and around the world, they are looking for number go up because their lives are difficult and they just want to make money to survive and to buy a house and to improve their lives?
Yeah, I think there is that element of individuals trying to kind of look for a way, for a means of survival, because I mean you actually know the situation in Zimbabwe. When it comes down to individuals that wish to obtain, let's say, jobs in Zim, it gets a little difficult. Hence, being forth individuals now try to do businesses and little side hustles to try and get food on the table. I mean, like the most common one is individuals that maybe sell on the street, but now at the same time you're trying to obtain money for food on the table, and then the city council is against individuals having to sell illegally on these streets. So usually what you tend to get is, every time a person is selling on these streets, city council comes, takes their things in a violent manner, and then just leaves with their stock. And then at the same time, also the average salary of a teacher in Zimbabwe is around like $200. And if you literally compare the cost of living as compared to, let's say, like a teacher maybe in the United States or in the UK or anywhere else, that salary having to be earned by the average teacher isn't really the same, or it's not really fair for most Zimbabweans. So they tend to look for these quick money kind of things, and it kind of moves their paradigm towards it. So I think it's kind of like a double-edged sword in a way, that of course their mentality and their view of what Bitcoin is isn't really 100% and or even relevant, but you kind of do understand where they are coming from as a Zimbabwean, because you understand that like currency is constantly fading, and a lot of money is usually looted, and it's very difficult for the average Zimbabwean to get to a certain standpoint in which the wealthy most of the time in Zimbabwe kind of have the upper advantage.
Do some people think it's a scam?
Oh yes. Oh yes, oh yes. That is that is a very, very common one, because I remember like I remember there was this one time we uh, were in town with a friend of mine, and we're having this conversation with this man that sells suits. We're trying to ask him about I mean, as a Bitcoiner, it's always like your moral obligation to try and spread the word orange pill as much people as you actually can. He had this misconception that Bitcoin is more or less like an international Ponzi scheme. It is something that is a bubble. And then we've tried by all means to try and change his perspective, that no, one, if you, because according to history, there was actually a time in which people actually traded tulips on, I think, on the futures exchange. I tried to put that example to say that individuals had no idea how much was the supply of these tulips, but they would just trade them back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And also, there wasn't any fixed amount. So I tried to explain the need of the concept of supply and demand when it comes down to an asset. But then it's just that the conception of that it's a scam also comes from the element that there are a lot of forex traders here, a lot of forex traders and people that tend to steal money from individuals, portraying themselves that they can take $100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 100,000, 10,000, and so on and so forth. Their misconception really resides around their environment.
So tell us how you and Bitcoin Reach are trying to educate people in Zimbabwe and what's your process for educating?
So basically, with Bitcoin Reach, we've kind of come with the approach of meetups. So usually every month now and then, we tend to host these physical meetups just to try and educate people, but not like in a very strict kind of classroom like setup, but in a setup whereby we usually take maybe people to a restaurant or at times to like an office setup whereby we have a projector and everything. And then during those times, we tend to invite individuals that are new to Bitcoin, or even some. There are actually some Bitcoiners here in Zim, and when we actually meet up with them, we just kind of have a breakdown approach from the beginning of the question of what is money. So we take them all the way down from what is money, and how money works, what defines money that has value, and then as we go on, then we then get to a point whereby an individual then understands the basic understanding of what Bitcoin is. Then after that, we have a mini course like which is free from me Premier. So basically, we just let individuals go onto that course and then answer questions every now and then. And then also for a certain period, we also used to give them like little tests, examinations, just to try and jog their memory on the understanding and just to make sure they kind of keep it rooted and have a true Bitcoiner's aspect and a true Bitcoiner's mentality when it comes down to what Bitcoin is overall. Currently, right now, and I think we've been able to onboard, I think, about like 400 people in the past year as well, having to teach them from the very get go, from the very beginning. And there's quite a lot of individuals that have now been able to now move straight into the paradigm of being true Bitcoin.
That's wonderful. Congrats. That's really
Thank
great.
you. Thank you
How
so
do you
much.
buy Bitcoin in Zimbabwe?
Now that is another tricky part now. So there are individuals that are basically agents. So as agents, what these people do is they tend to buy Bitcoin maybe off platforms such as no one's or maybe off exchange P2P platforms. And they know most banks in Zimbabwe, it's quite difficult to on-ramp and off-ramp Bitcoin. So they saw this and then do these transactions maybe through something like PayPal or and etc. And when they then sell it to people here, they tend to sell it at a premium that is rather extremely high. So they can say maybe something like to buy a certain amount of Bitcoin, you need to pay 8% plus $4 gas fee charge just to try and flatten out the gas fees. But now, at times, there are cases in which gas fees can go up. So you find yourself in a situation having to pay high amounts of gas fees and high amount of the individual's premium. So they tend to make like quite a large amount of money through having to capitalize the fact that in Zimbabwe it's quite difficult to acquire Bitcoin. And then also the other issue is that people tend to see that premium and then get scared because as an individual, you would want to kind of dollar cost average your BTC, like maybe here, like $10, 100, 1,000. But now, what kind of scares people now is those extra premiums now. Because I remember there's a time when even even my mother, I was trying to give her just a new perspective on Bitcoin. So then she then got interested in it, and then when she was buying it, she then heard the premiums that they are extremely large, and then she kind of got a little skeptical around it. But then I had to explain that now the fact that you are buying this Bitcoin, and then it then comes into your self custody. That is usually how we tend to acquire Bitcoin in Zimbabwe. So it's in a manner that is it's not really to our advantage. But I have seen a few exchanges that tend to allow individuals to send money via, let's say, MasterCard or Visa to them, and then you can still acquire your Bitcoin on the exchange like Kraken, Binance as well. But that's the thing. Most individuals tend to leave their Bitcoin on the exchange. And what we tend to preach is self custody. And them leaving it there is not self custody. And then eventually, when the exchange shuts down, they can tend to say, no, no, Bitcoin is a scam. But just those general blocks that we tend to teach now in meetups that self custody is the very essence of what Bitcoin is.
And do you think that people in Zimbabwe are mostly using it as a savings technology now, or are some people using it as a money?
Well, the people in Zimbabwe mostly that have now gotten into Bitcoin have now shifted their perspective into a lot of shitcoins, unfortunately, because, like I said, they have this mentality to tend to want a get rich quick scheme. But we do have in the individuals that use it now as a saving mechanism now, mostly individuals that have gone through our our meetups and our educations. There is a certain amount of individuals that now use it as a saving technology and a saving mechanism. Now, the amount of individuals now that now use it as money is very kind of low because they don't really know how to off ramp it into, let's say, US dollars and etc etc. Some that tend to use it in the form of a mechanism for selling and buying, but also that amount is kind of limited. And then there's the individuals that tend to move into the aspect of shitcoins.
Yeah, it is a challenge in Zimbabwe. I know in Kenya, because I've interviewed several people in Kenya, that in Kenya there are apps that automatically switch Bitcoin into the Kenyan shilling or the Kenyan money and back, and people don't even know if they're using Bitcoin. So eventually technology is going to evolve, and I know there's the Lightning Network that people use, which are lower fees than the base layer. So eventually we hope to get more of that all over the world.
That's true because, like, for a certain amount of time, there's a little bit of hesitation when it comes down to the using of a certain technology within a certain area. Because I think in El Salvador as well, there was still a little bit of hesitation when they started to introduce Bitcoin on like a legal standard now. And there was some that would protest against it, some that were actually pro it. And I think it also does come back down to the fact that I think it's basic human nature that within the beginning periods of like a certain revolution, there's certain concepts that can't be forgotten. I think the same thing with the use of having to use emails as well. There were still people that were still using telegrams or even letters, but now eventually it just comes within society.
Yeah. So tell us how Bitcoin might help address some of the financial inclusion challenges faced by many Zimbabweans.
I think maybe to actually start it out, I think Bitcoin in itself, I believe it was created to be a store of value. That's one. Now, I've always had this perspective that Bitcoin can't really be used as money having to move back and forth, buying and selling. But because I mean the prices usually quite change, and having to keep up with that at times it can be a little bit difficult. But overall, we do know how the trajectory of Bitcoin is in the long run. But for day-to-day selling, I've always believed that the use of, let's say, a stable coin that is having to be backed up by Bitcoin would kind of give a little bit of financial inclusion Zimbabwe, because one issue about Zimbabwe now currently we have the use of a currency that apparently they say is backed up by gold. But now, in essence, the reality is you can't really see the gold. You've never seen it. I've never seen it. No one really knows the amount of gold that is actually there in reserve. And now we tend to not really have like much of like a stable currency overall. So, financial inclusion now, to answer that part, I think if we were to have, let's say, in Zimbabwe, hypothetically speaking, if we were to now start to have, like, let's say, a stable coin that is backed by, let's say, Bitcoin, and in turn, individuals are now able to earn money that is of value over time, that is able to get them the amount of needs and wants over time.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure how stable coins backed by Bitcoin work, but I do know that Jeff Booth says that if Bitcoin fails as a unit of account, a money, it will fail as a store of value. So Bitcoin has to succeed as a money to succeed as a store of value. And I highly recommend listening to Jeff Booth. I had an interview with him right in the beginning of my journey, and it was amazing. And I'm going to interview him again in a month. But he has vision that very few people have. And so I am a big proponent of using Bitcoin. The second layers will be developed, and Lightning and Fediment and other layers are being developed. It's just a matter of the rest of the world getting them. But anything that involves fiat is long term going to fail. So, stable coins are not my expertise, but yeah, it's something to think about. So, tell us about how Bitcoin is regulated in Zimbabwe, and are the Zimbabwe officials aware of Bitcoin?
Yeah, well, in Zimbabwe, we have an implicit ban on Bitcoin. So, like I said, with the banks, it's quite difficult for an individual to on ramp and off ramp. So, where this ban actually came from originally, there was a little bit of a period whereby there was a Bitcoin exchange in Zimbabwe. So, I'm not sure to detail what had actually happened, but apparently a lot of individuals lost their money due to that ATM. But I think at the same time, I do believe that there must have been a little bit of government involvement that maybe they wanted to receive maybe a piece of the profits that were being made there, and then maybe they might have said no, and eventually thus resulting to the implicit ban on Bitcoin. So currently, right now, as Zimbabweans, you can trade in Bitcoin amongst each other, but there's no regulatory body that is kind of overseeing all of this. The other difficult thing was, I remember, was it last year? There was a period of time in which they would send, let's say, officials to our Bitcoin Reach group, and then asking, let's say, questions like, "Please tell us more about Bitcoin." And you tend to understand that they they don't really want to to regulate it in the sense that to give power to the people. If we are to regulate this, how can we benefit from it at first. Before last year, there was a time in which they went after all of the individuals that were selling Bitcoin as a business. And then what then happened was they didn't really have any section to point out that this is a crime under ABCD. There wasn't any basis to that. So most individuals kind of just gave a bribe and then were let go. But that's just the general outlook that is currently in Zim. So I mean, for advantage's sake, like no one's really taxed for it, but yeah, that's the current outlook. But then hopefully in future, if government intervention does come, we tend to get, let's say, a little bit of a less scrupulous approach amongst individuals having to scam one another. So yeah, but in as comparison to the way that, let's say, America has now maybe adopted Bitcoin to a certain degree because they now have a reserve, but aren't really actively buying it. But still, I think it's still a start that eventually most nations might kind of FOMO into that same thing.
Well, Zimbabwe doesn't tend to follow America, do they?
Not at
No.
all, unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. But I mean, I think like it's like a block of dominoes, like maybe one effect, and then because Zimbabwe tends to follow China mostly. Like China is really favored here, especially in individuals that come and open companies here from China. They are really welcome, open arms, and hopefully, if China does, Zimbabwe might actually consider and start looking more to it.
And maybe you guys will also educate some of those Zimbabwe officials because, after all, they are just people too. And once you go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, you tend to want a better world for everybody.
That is true. That is very true. The thing about having to educate people on Bitcoin, at first for me, it was kind of like the perspective that I just want to maybe just get the word out there. But then within time, it became something that was more ingrained within me because I now find myself every 2 minutes um, having to orange pill every person I meet on the road for some reason, or if I'm at the shops or the mall, I just tend to just ask the question, "Do you understand what is money?" and just start a conversation from there. So yeah,
Yeah, me too. I when I was there in December, I go to get water from somebody there, and I tell the guy every time, "Have you bought Bitcoin yet? I'm going to tip you, but I want you to buy Bitcoin." So every time my mom goes now to get water, he says, "Yeah, your daughter's trying to get me to buy Bitcoin." Yeah, so I also try. um, and I interviewed Dylan. I don't know if you know Dylan, who sent a proposal to the Zimbabwe government to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet, just like the US. So he wrote a really good proposal, and there are people trying from all over the world to get Bitcoin recognized.
nice thing about a Bitcoiner, we tend to have this approach that eventually one day those doors tend to open eventually, and one one day at a time, having to orange pill one person at a time, eventually it is something that tends to be taken in with open arms. And we also hope that eventually there's some individuals that can now approach it from a standpoint to have a better form of store value, a better form of money for the longer term, for generations to come. Because I remember there was this one meetup that we once had. There was this story this man who was telling us in 2009. He had a certain amount of money he had saved up with his wife in their bank account. And then as soon as inflation hit, they lost everything. their savings and everything, which is kind of sad because he's not the only one. There are quite a number of individuals that have lost money due to a money system that isn't really of quality. It's just based on quantity, how much more we can actually print at the end of the day.
Yep, that happened to my mom too in 2008, 2009, when the Zimbabwe dollar just added, I don't know how many nine zeros, and her pension went to zero. So many Zimbabweans that's happened to, and they've had to make a plan to survive. And even with that, my mom's much older now. She understands Bitcoin, but it's not something she wants to adopt because it's a bit difficult for that age group. But have you had luck with family and friends?
Friends, yeah, quite a lot. I have some friends of mine that now most of them kind of bank their money in Bitcoin. Others tend to, let's say, they want to use the leverage on exchanges to try and obtain more, which I kind of say is a little risky. But I mean, yes, family, there's a certain amount. I mean, my mother recently, she has been trying to go into the concept of Bitcoin. My girlfriend, yeah, she has been now having to buy Bitcoin quite a lot. As an individual, you tend to influence those around you. So there's a certain amount of people that within time they tend to see how well it's actually been having to do for you. Because I also think another thing that tends to scare a lot of people is the price volatility. No one can really tend to stomach the price volatility, but I always try and tell them that don't look at the amount of money you can make in US dollars with Bitcoin, but look at the amount of Bitcoin you are able to have for yourself as an individual. Because, I mean, it's 21 million in supply. One day it's going to be finished. It's going to be finished. So, the amount that you have, make sure you get enough Bitcoin for yourself as an individual, but not for how much money you can make. Because I've really kind of liked the approach that Michael Saylor has actually kind of gone with it, because he has been one inspirational individual when it comes down to having to buy Bitcoin. Like, hey, every now and then, 2 billion worth, and that level of commitment does show something, and a level of dedication towards a certain vision in mind.
Yes, he does. And I love the idea that you mentioned about measuring in sats rather than in fiat money or dollars, because long term on a Bitcoin standard, we will measure in sats and the cost of goods will be in sats and dollars maybe at the same time, but hopefully eventually only in sats because it's a much better world on a Bitcoin standard. Nobody's printing, nobody is creating inflation, and it's a fairer world for all. So tell us how Bitcoin has changed you.
Me, it's really opened up because I mean I tend to meet quite a lot of individuals and been able to have to change their way of thinking over time. It really puts a smile on my face to see an individual kind of not having to look at Bitcoin as how much money they can make, but how much. It's really been something for me to kind of change my perspective of having to be a more compassionate individual, having to share a technology that is of value, right? And also, it's also been able to open up doors for me in, let's say, a financial aspect, because every time I would make a certain amount of money, my salary as well, I've been able to keep it over time. And then my savings, I mean, for me, it's been really good ever since I have gone through this road. But I think the one thing that I think personally kind of stands out for me as having to change a person's perspective, having to change one's dynamic in which how one can view what money is. How can one actually be able to store something for their family, for the next person, for even them as people overall. So I think just to answer your question, my ability to be a more compassionate person to having to share this information, because what I also do notice is that most people tend to charge people with this information, because most tend to come to me and then ask, so how much are you going to charge me? I'm like, I'm not going to charge you anything. This is free. It's free. The more Bitcoin you purchase, I mean, of course, even for me eventually, the price does also impact well. But just that very get go, having to not have to charge for information like that, because within Zim there is the perspective that, especially for forex traders, right? So remember that I said that forex traders tend to accompany the same thing between Bitcoin and Forex. So people tend to put it under one umbrella. So when people, let's say, come for the meetups, they are shocked that, okay, what is it that you want from me? Because you can't give me this free food, this good information for nothing. I'm like, no, this is all just for you as an individual to take this knowledge and be able to take yourself up as well. Because when it comes down to the use of money, I do think that it is something very important for individuals to acknowledge and really be able to put it within them, and their their mindset has to really shift when it comes down to having to handle their finances per se.
And do you find by giving this gift of education to people, you get given back too?
I get given back to What I get given back is mostly a smile on someone's face, mostly the the warm aspect of having an individual come back to me and say, ever since that day, during I've really kind of viewed money differently. It's always put a smile on my face for an individual to come back to me and then say, I'm really, really glad you were able to bring me up upon this road, because now I'm now able to let's say invest into something that I believe is of value. Because at times, mostly in Zim as well, most individuals tend to look at different business models, the not so legal sector. Most individuals tend to go and dig gold in illegal mines, and then it's legal and also kind of dangerous. And some individuals tend to do that thing of selling on the street. And for them, there's a lot of risks involved. So when I tell them that there is a form of money that, even if after whatever it is that you do to obtain, you don't have to let it wither away into ashes or into complete nothingness, just because they just constantly keep printing an infinite amount of money, have to find it in which you can store for yourself. Like I said, when it comes down to Zimbabweans, there's a certain group of individuals that do kind of save, but even if they do save, the money in which they save is really less, because the money that they get is also kind of less.
Yeah. So, how do you think governments in Africa could approach Bitcoin?
How do I think they could approach Bitcoin? How do I think they can approach Bitcoin? I mean, I can have my own perspective on this, but maybe others may have a different approach. But I think governments in Africa need a strategic Bitcoin reserve. I think they actually do need a strategic Bitcoin reserve to be able to, let's say, maintain a form of a stable kind of economy, or an economy that whereby it's not constantly, because if I could literally draw on a graph right now, I can say, especially for Zim, the economy for us is literally up for a certain period of time, then it comes down. Up, certain period goes down. Then we change currencies. Up, certain period come down once more. So I think the first approach having to maybe on to kind of approach a Bitcoin standard would be maybe to look at countries that that have approached Bitcoin. Like look at the likes of El Salvador. Look at even the United States at the moment. Look at the likes of countries that have actually done this and try and replicate the same thing, but not to replicate something of because most governments within Africa tend to replicate maybe something that happened in the past because they still kind of rely on the element of a gold standard only and nothing else. A gold standard only and something that they're really proud of. But if they kind of approach it from a standpoint to maybe first create a strategic reserve. Maybe secondly, having to allow individuals to now buy and sell Bitcoin, not in a way that they have to do it on the street, but also kind of legalize it. I think having to legalize it would be one aspect because I do think there's individuals that tend to wait for governments to say thumbs up, it's a good thing, and then they also kind of follow suit eventually. So if they tend to now allow people to on ramp and offer Bitcoin using their centralized banks, which I do think kind of brings people back, but also I do think it's kind of a little bit of a double edged sword in a sense because we did kind of create Bitcoin with the perspective that it has to be decentralized. It has to be something that has to be for the people only. So I think it's kind of a little bit of a double-edged sword there.
Bitcoin is for everybody. But the great thing about Bitcoin is that people can buy it and front run governments because governments take forever. So we want people to buy it first because we can't stop governments buying it, right? The main thing is that it stays decentralized and secure. And it will because nodes are all over the world and people are all over the world. Doesn't matter how much Bitcoin you have, you still only have one vote as how Bitcoin goes long term. So, yeah, I think it's great. Well, for our last question, tell us, what does freedom mean to you?
The need of an individual to not require another person to dictate one's ability to do anything, basically. I think Bitcoin to me is freedom in the sense that it kind of takes out the banks, it takes out the financial institutions, it takes out the greedy people that have maybe stolen wealth from individuals over time. And freedom to me means that I get to dictate what I can do with my own money. I get to dictate how I can use my money. I get to dictate how much money I can even leave the country with. I think to me that defines freedom because I believe currently right now in Zim we have this policy that says you cannot leave the country. I think was it 5,000, 5,000, nothing more than 5,000, and which tends to be a little bit of a hindrance to a certain degree, and of which when you want to leave the country with a certain amount, you need permission, and I think that tends to keep one constrained in chains to a certain degree, and of which I think Bitcoin is the key to having to unlock that. So that is what freedom means to me.
Wonderful. Yes, Bitcoin is freedom money. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Michael. Keep up the good work educating people in Zimbabwe and tell us where people can find you.
You can find me on X mostly at Michael Mushunje, and you can also find me on Instagram as well. And then eventually, I am planning to open a YouTube channel, hoping to help individuals. I just need to get more equipment and a good setup so that it can actually go quite well. But I do believe as soon as I have opened that YouTube channel, it'll be on my XP.
Wonderful. Well, I'll put links below and I urge you to start now. Don't wait.
Definitely.